Why is Africa expected to seek approval from the West to change its own countries? Why does the West feel entitled to command Africans, including President Tulia of the IPU? Tulia, however, didn't back down. She gave the West a lesson in humility. So, what happened next? Let's find out. In a bold display of independence, Africa, led by figures like Madame Tulia, president of the Interparliamentary Union IPU, has declared that it will no longer seek approval for its diplomatic or political actions. Madame Tulia's recent engagement with Russia, which has caused an uproar in Western circles, is just the latest example of Africa's growing assertion of its sovereignty. This shift marks the end of an era where Africa's decisions were dictated or questioned by external powers. But as always, it has triggered the West. But why do such things about Africa trigger the West? Africa's assertion of independence is a powerful reminder that the days of Western dominance over the continent are coming to an end. For far too long, the West has clung to the outdated notion that Africa, despite its resources, culture, and potential, needs to be guided like a child in need of supervision. When Madame Tulia declared, "We are not colonized in our minds," it was more than just a bold statement. It was a clear indication that Africa is no longer seeking external validation to define its course.
Give me a chance to lead this institution according to the ideals that we stand for. Not to crucify me just because I come from some country. Some of you maybe feel like we are still colonized in the mind. No. No, we are not. No, we are not. So please.
This independence is deeply unsettling for the West, as it challenges the very core of their historical control. The outrage from Western governments and media over Tulia's engagement with Russia wasn't merely a diplomatic concern. It was a visceral, emotional reaction to losing control over Africa's decisions. The extension tactic was on full display, as Western commentators took this one act of diplomacy and spun it into a narrative of impending doom for democracy. Africa's interaction with Putin became symbolic of a larger threat, as though the continent engaging with non-Western powers is an existential crisis for global stability. The exaggeration here is not accidental. It is a deliberate attempt to paint Africa's growing autonomy as a danger. But what is it that the West fears? The idea of an Africa that is no longer reliant on Western approval is a direct challenge to the power structures that have long benefited Western nations. These structures have been built on the assumption that Africa's resources, decisions, and future are something that must be controlled, or at least influenced, by the West. The moment Africa steps outside of that framework, as Madame Tulia did with her diplomatic engagement with Russia, the entire narrative begins to crumble. Madame Tulia's decision to engage with Putin was an exercise of Africa's right to diplomacy, something that Western nations do every day without question. However, the outrage it sparked reveals a fundamental truth. The West still views Africa's independence as something that needs to be managed, not celebrated. This mindset is rooted in a colonial hangover, where Africa is seen as a continent that must be guided for its good. The West's reaction to Tulia's engagement with Russia exposes the insecurity that lies at the heart of this thinking. For the West, Africa's growing independence threatens to upend decades, if not centuries, of control. If Africa no longer needs Western oversight, what does that mean for the power dynamics that have long defined the relationship between the two? It means those dynamics are shifting, and the West is scrambling to maintain its influence. Tulia's actions are just one example of a broader trend. Africa is asserting its sovereignty, and the West is finding it increasingly difficult to cope. But the West's discomfort with Africa's independence doesn't end with emotional outbursts. Their response reveals a deeper strategy, one based on misinterpreting Africa's actions to maintain control. How does this serve their broader agenda of maintaining control? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Misinterpretation is not just a mistake. It's a deliberate tactic used to control the narrative and maintain influence over a rising power. When the West misinterprets Africa's actions, particularly in the case of Madame Tulia's engagement with Russia, it is not due to confusion or lack of understanding. It is a calculated move to twist Africa's intentions, framing them in a way that keeps Africa dependent on Western approval. Let's break this down. Madame Tulia, in her diplomatic visit to Russia, was exercising Africa's right to engage with global powers on its terms. Yet, the Western media and political establishment pounced on the visit, portraying it as a reckless move that undermined democracy. This is where homonymity comes into play, a tactic where words or actions are deliberately misinterpreted to fit a specific narrative. In this case, Tulia's diplomatic engagement was twisted to suggest that Africa was somehow aligning itself with authoritarianism, simply because it did not consult the West first.
Madam President, I would like to ask you about your last trip to Russia. What did you feel when shaking hands with the war criminal Putin from a terrorist regime in Russia? What especially mandated you, who especially mandated you to represent the IPU, and what benefit did this visit bring to democracy and not to Russian propaganda? Do you agree that your visit to Russia before visiting victim country Ukraine was a mistake, and do you regret it? Thank you.
This tactic is part of a broader strategy to keep Africa in a subordinate position on the global stage. The West has long used misinterpretation to frame Africa's actions in a way that justifies continued oversight. If Africa's leaders are portrayed as reckless, irresponsible, or out of touch with global norms, it becomes easier for the West to argue that they still need to guide Africa. This narrative is not about protecting democracy or ensuring global stability. It's about maintaining control. But the hypocrisy here is glaring. Western leaders engage with authoritarian regimes all the time, without facing the same level of scrutiny. For instance, when Western leaders visit countries like Israel, known for its controversial policies, there is little to no outcry. However, when an African leader meets with Russia, it suddenly becomes a global issue. This selective outrage reveals the West's use of appeal to authority. They invoke moral principles only when it serves their interests. In reality, the outrage over Tulia's engagement with Russia is not about democracy or human rights. It's about the West losing its grip on Africa's foreign policy. Their whole argument is invalid.
A concern was raised by Iraq in respect of the report that I've just given you, and Iraq was questioning why did I visit Russia in the context of the war in Ukraine and not Gaza. I would like to inform my colleague that you might note that in November last year, I visited Palestine and I visited Israel and I met the leaders. And that was my first visit after becoming president in October. So it's not like I have ignored what is happening in the Middle East, what is happening in Lebanon, what is happening in Gaza, and what happened in Israel. So I treat all the conflicts the same way. And you might also want to note the conflicts that we are talking about in the Middle East, the war that we are talking about in Ukraine, they are not the only conflicts that IPU is looking at. We are concerned about what is happening in Yemen. We are concerned about what is happening in Syria. We are concerned about what is happening in Sudan.
The West also relies heavily on the appeal to popular opinion to bolster its case. By framing Africa's actions as being out of step with global consensus, the West tries to isolate Africa diplomatically. The message is clear. Everyone else is sanctioning Russia, so why isn't Africa? This tactic is designed to make Africa appear as a rogue state, out of touch with international norms. But the reality is much more complex. Africa is not bound to follow the West's script. It has its interests, priorities, and alliances that shape its foreign policy decisions. The West's misinterpretation of Tulia's engagement with Russia is a prime example of how this tactic is used to maintain control. By twisting the narrative, the West seeks to undermine Africa's growing independence, casting it as dangerous or irresponsible. However, this strategy is becoming less effective as Africa continues to assert its sovereignty on the global stage. The more the West misinterprets Africa's actions, the more transparent its agenda becomes. The real fear here is not that Africa will align itself with Russia or undermine global democracy. The real fear is that Africa will continue to assert its independence, making decisions based on its interests rather than seeking approval from Western powers. This shift is already happening, and the West's misinterpretation of Africa's actions is a sign of their desperation to maintain control in a world where Africa no longer plays by their rules. The West's misinterpretation of Africa's actions is part of a broader strategy of emotional manipulation. But why is the West so emotionally invested in Africa's decisions? Emotional manipulation is one of the most insidious tactics used by the West to maintain control over Africa. It's a strategy designed to provoke emotional responses from African leaders and the global community, shifting the focus away from Africa's legitimate actions and onto a narrative of betrayal and moral outrage. The West's emotional investment in Africa's decisions is not about protecting democracy or ensuring global stability. It's about maintaining a psychological hold over the continent. Madame Tulia's visit to Russia is a perfect example of this tactic in action. The West's reaction wasn't just diplomatic concern, it was a full-blown emotional outcry, as though Africa had committed some offense. This is the essence of making the opponent angry. The West is trying to provoke an emotional response from Africa, forcing its leaders to defend actions that should require no defense. By framing Tulia's engagement with Russia as a betrayal of democratic values, the West is using emotional manipulation to sway global opinion. The message is clear. Africa is acting against the interests of the international community by engaging with Russia, and therefore, it must be brought back in line. This narrative plays on the emotions of the global audience, particularly those who are already invested in the conflict between Russia and the West. This emotional manipulation obscures the truth. Africa is simply exercising its right to self-determination, something the West claims to support, but only when it aligns with its interests. This emotional manipulation is also designed to keep Africa on the defensive. By constantly provoking emotional responses, the West forces African leaders to justify their actions, rather than allowing them to focus on their agenda. This tactic keeps Africa trapped in a cycle of reaction, where its leaders are constantly responding to accusations and criticisms, rather than moving forward with their own diplomatic goals. It's a classic control tactic. Keep your opponent distracted and off balance, and they won't have the time or energy to pursue their interests. But the most insidious aspect of this emotional manipulation is that it hides the West's moral failings. By focusing the narrative on Africa's supposed betrayal, the West diverts attention away from its involvement in global conflicts and human rights abuses. The outrage over Tulia's visit to Russia conveniently ignores the fact that Western powers continue to engage with authoritarian regimes without facing the same level of scrutiny. This selective outrage is a form of appeal to emotions. It plays on the global audience's fear of instability and desire for moral clarity, while ignoring the West's complicity in creating the very instability they claim to oppose. The emotional manipulation employed by the West is not just about controlling Africa's actions, it's about controlling the global narrative. By painting Africa as a rogue actor, the West hopes to rally international opinion against the continent's growing independence. But this strategy is becoming less effective as more African leaders, like Tulia, refuse to be drawn into the emotional trap set by the West. Instead of reacting to the emotional manipulation, Africa is asserting its sovereignty with calm, measured responses, refusing to be pulled into a game designed to keep them on the defensive. While emotional manipulation is a powerful tool, the West also uses more subtle tactics to maintain control, such as presenting false dilemmas that limit Africa's choices. How does this tactic work, and what impact does it have on Africa's foreign policy? The false dilemma is one of the most effective tools in the West's arsenal for maintaining control over Africa. By presenting Africa with only two extreme options, the West forces the continent into a position where it must choose between two unsatisfactory outcomes, neither of which serves its best interests. This tactic is designed to limit Africa's foreign policy choices, keeping the continent trapped in a cycle of reaction and dependence. In the case of Madame Tulia's visit to Russia, the false dilemma was clear. Africa must either support Ukraine and align with Western values, or engage with Russia and be branded as anti-democratic. This binary framing ignores the reality of Africa's complex foreign policy landscape, where decisions are made based on a wide range of factors, including economic interests, regional stability, and historical alliances. The West's use of false dilemmas is not new. It has been a cornerstone of their foreign policy strategy for decades. Whether it's in trade negotiations, international diplomacy, or military engagements, Africa is constantly presented with two extremes, neither of which truly serves its interests. The goal is to keep Africa trapped in a position where it is forced to defend its actions, rather than pursuing a more nuanced, independent foreign policy. But the real impact of this tactic goes beyond limiting Africa's choices. It also reinforces the narrative that Africa is incapable of making its own decisions. By presenting Africa with only two extreme options, the West implies that the continent lacks the sophistication or understanding to navigate the complexities of global diplomacy. This is a deeply condescending view, one that harks back to the colonial mindset that Africa must be guided by more civilized nations. The false dilemma also serves to distract from the West's inconsistencies. While Africa is criticized for engaging with Russia, the West itself continues to engage with regimes that have questionable records on democracy and human rights. This double standard reinforces the idea that Africa is being held to a different set of rules, one that is designed to limit its sovereignty and keep it dependent on Western approval. But Africa is no longer playing by these rules. The continent is increasingly rejecting the false choices presented by the West and instead charting the course. Madame Tulia's visit to Russia is just one example of how Africa is breaking free from these false dilemmas. By engaging with global powers on its terms, Africa is showing the world that it can make its own decisions, without needing permission from anyone. So, false dilemmas are a powerful tool, but they are often accompanied by personal attacks designed to undermine Africa's leadership. And why does the West rely on these personal attacks, and how do they serve their broader agenda? When all else fails, the West resorts to ad hominem attacks, personal attacks that distract from the real issues at hand. Madame Tulia, for example, has been the target of personal criticism, with the West questioning her motives, character, and decision-making abilities. But these attacks aren't about Tulia herself. They are about undermining Africa's growing independence. By focusing on Tulia's personal decisions, rather than the broader political context, the West hopes to shift the narrative away from Africa's right to self-governance. This tactic serves to delegitimize not only Tulia's leadership, but also the broader movement of African leaders asserting their independence on the global stage. Silencing the opponent is another tactic at play here. When Madame Tulia pointed out that she had visited Palestine and Israel without facing the same level of scrutiny, the West's response was silence. This selective attention reveals the true agenda. The West is less concerned with Africa's diplomatic engagements and more concerned with maintaining its control over the narrative. By ignoring Africa's legitimate points, the West hopes to keep Africa in a subservient position, constantly seeking external approval. These personal attacks are not just a critique of Tulia as an individual. They are an attack on the idea of African leadership itself. By undermining African leaders, the West seeks to reinforce the narrative that Africa cannot govern itself without external guidance. But this narrative is crumbling as more African leaders, like Tulia, reject these personal attacks and assert their right to lead on their terms. Personal attacks are also a way for the West to deflect attention from their shortcomings. By focusing the narrative on Tulia's personal choices, the West avoids addressing the broader issues at play, such as the shifting power dynamics between Africa and the West. These attacks serve to distract from the fact that Africa is no longer willing to play by the West's rules and is instead asserting its sovereignty on the global stage. Africa is charting its course, engaging with global powers on its terms, and demanding respect on the world stage. The West's outdated tactics are failing, and Africa is asserting its sovereignty with confidence. In the end, Africa isn't asking for permission anymore, and the world will have to adapt to this new reality.
I would be given a little credit for all the efforts that I've done, not to be crucified for things that I have not. You're asking here who mandated me, who mandated the former president who came from the 12 plus to visit Kiev, who mandated him? Please, I think we have to reach a point where I have explained myself several times to you 12 plus, to everybody else who cared to understand. If you have a feeling like I went to Russia without going to Ukraine first, I have told you several times letters were sent out. I wouldn't turn out my visit to Russia because I'm unable to reach Ukraine. You didn't ask me similar questions when I visited Israel, did you? You didn't ask me similar questions when I visited Palestine, did you? You're not going to ask me similar questions when I visit Sudan. You're not going to ask me similar questions when I visit other places. I think, colleagues, let's have trust. You have elected a president who is supposed to deliver to her mandate. You have elected a president who is supposed to deliver to her mandate.
Do you think Africa will bear any longer? Why doesn't the West understand that? Let us know in the comment section. What must be done to make them stop thinking they are masters? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.